It all started with one upload, and by the time Huntsville hit play, reputations were burning, alliances were crumbling, and the man who thought he was untouchable was watching his empire collapse in real time. The quiet hum of Huntsville's gossip scene didn't just rise on its own, it detonated the instant Tasha K hit upload. One video was all it took to turn Alabama's usually tame reality TV chatter into a full-blown spectacle. This wasn't some throwaway rumor people scrolled past between memes. It was the kind of revelation that made you sit up, rewind twice, and send the link to every group chat with a shocked, "Y'all seeing this?" typed in all caps. When Tasha K alleged that Martell Holt had threatened Melody with an intimate recording, time seemed to stop online. It wasn't merely the claim, it was the venom laced within it. The notion of a man using something so personal, so private, as a weapon against the woman who once built her world around him, struck a deep chord. Fans didn't need evidence to sense the cruelty. The accusation itself reshaped public opinion faster than any reunion brawl or shady Instagram live ever could. This wasn't just entertainment anymore. It was the unraveling of a man whose entire persona was built on control. For years, Martell carried arrogance like a designer suit, polished, rehearsed, and impenetrable. He laughed off criticism, brushed aside pain, and turned serious moments into punchlines. But this time, the smirk didn't land. The charm he once wore so effortlessly curdled into something darker. Viewers no longer saw confidence. They saw cowardice. The swagger that once drew attention now revealed emptiness. And slowly, the sympathy shifted. Melody became the calm at the center of his chaos. Melody's strength didn't roar. It whispered. She didn't need to scream, slam doors, or fire back online. Her restraint, her quiet composure in courtrooms, in hallways, even in elevators became its own kind of statement. The infamous elevator clip told the story best. When Arionne Curry tried to provoke her, weaponizing her status as the other woman, Melody didn't flinch. Her refusal to crack became the victory. Viewers looped that clip endlessly, analyzing every expression, Arionne's forced smirk, Martell's vacant stare, and drew their own conclusions about who truly held the power in that moment. Arionne had long tried to rewrite her narrative, insisting she was more than a footnote in Martell's saga. But every post, every interview, only reminded the audience how deeply she was tied to his dysfunction. Her online bravado began to read as desperation, a scramble for relevance in a story that had moved on without her. The more she clapped back, the more fans dissected her contradictions, and her refusal to take responsibility turned her into a cautionary subplot of her own. Meanwhile, Martell's reputation continued its downward spiral. Whispers of shady deals, secret group chats, and screenshots hinting at blackmail began circulating. Whether those claims were real or rumor hardly mattered anymore. The public had already rendered its verdict. To them, Martell embodied everything people were tired of in reality TV: deflection, and an allergy to accountability. This scandal didn't stay confined to fan blogs or gossip pages either. It bled into the real world. Hashtags calling out sponsors for complicity gained traction. Businesses pulled back. Even Martell's longtime co-stars, once masters of neutrality, found their silence under fire. Fans wanted answers, and alliances that had held for years began to crumble under the collective outrage. For Martell, the realization came too late. Charm could no longer save him. No soundbite, no well-rehearsed interview could shift the narrative now. Each denial only confirmed what viewers already believed: that he wasn't a misunderstood man caught in controversy, but the architect of his own downfall, the villain of his own story. And villains don't get redemption arcs when the audience stops laughing. As whispers of lawsuits, audits, and federal investigations began circling, Martell's last currency good, once hailed as the embodiment of Huntsville's ambition, he now stood as its warning label. And in stark contrast, Melody emerged as the quiet victor, steady, unshaken, and finally recognized as the story's true protagonist. By the time the internet had finished with him, Martell wasn't controversial anymore, he was condemned. Social feeds overflowed with clips, memes, and commentary, turning him into a digital parable about ego and consequence. The sting wasn't in the rumors but in the speed with which the world stripped him bare. The same fans who once debated his motives now wondered aloud how they'd ever been fooled. His charm, the one thing he'd always banked on, had disintegrated overnight as Martell's empire crumbled. Melody's image was quietly being rebuilt from the ground up. No longer cast as the wounded ex-wife, she began to embody resilience itself, a woman who had endured public humiliation and still carried herself with unshakable dignity. The rallying cry, #ProtectMelody, didn't come from her PR team or a calculated campaign. It came from ordinary viewers, people who had grown tired of watching her grace be met with mockery. Every time Martell dismissed her pain or twisted the narrative, the chorus defending her only grew louder. The irony was almost poetic. His attempts to tarnish her name only polished her halo. Each jab, each smug denial, became another reason for the audience to rally behind her. In trying to strip her of power, he'd ended up gifting her a new kind, the kind that can't be staged or scripted. Meanwhile, Arionne Curry was being dragged into the storm, though not in the way she might have imagined. For years, she had leaned into the notoriety that came from being the woman Martell couldn't let go of. But as the tides shifted, her devotion began to look less like defiance and more like desperation. The one-staring other woman was no longer framed as a rebel against convention, but as an enabler of Martell's worst instincts. She wasn't fanning the flames for love, she was feeding the fire that would consume them both. That elevator confrontation with Melody became the defining symbol of her missteps. Aggressive, chaotic, rooted not in confidence but in insecurity. The internet dissected every second of it. What might have once been seen as boldness now read as bitterness. Arionne was branded the shadow, cheering for chaos, a woman so entangled in someone else's downfall that she couldn't see her own. And, in the middle of it all, sat Huntsville, its small city now caught in the glare of national scrutiny. Love and marriage. Huntsville had always thrived on tension, but this was different. The drama had crossed a line from entertaining to dangerous. Producers found themselves in a crisis they couldn't edit away. Reality TV craves mess. Yes, but not the kind that threatens its very survival. Sponsors grew anxious, debating whether to cut ties altogether. Behind closed doors, arguments flared. Some cast members wanted Martell gone to protect their own brands, while others worried that without him, the show would lose its magnetic chaos. What was once a storyline was now a legal and moral minefield. What fascinated fans most was Martell's double-edged response. Publicly, he laughed it all off, posing as the unbothered provocateur who thrived under fire. But behind the scenes, whispers painted a far darker picture. Rumors spread of paranoia, of secret recordings and private dirt he claimed to hold over everyone. Allegedly, he boasted about insurance, leverage strong enough to burn bridges if he ever went down. Whether true or not, it made people uneasy. This wasn't the charming playboy of reality TV fame anymore. This was someone using manipulation as a means of survival. The shift in perception was brutal and irreversible. Curiosity curdled into disgust, and disgust hit him where it hurt most, his wallet. Endorsements dried up, invitations vanished. Even the fans who once fought in his defense began deleting their old comments in embarrassment. In the ruthless marketplace of reality television, reputation is currency. And Martell's stock was crashing fast. Soon, he became the joke, the punchline of his own cautionary tale, not destroyed by one explosive scandal, but by a steady, unbroken chain of self-inflicted wounds. The fallout didn't end with him either. Arionne's desperate online defenses only made things worse. Each contradiction became ammunition for critics. Every time she tried to shift the blame, it circled back to her. The internet noticed how she seemed to glow when Melody stumbled, how she mistook provocation for empowerment. Sympathy never came. Instead, the public mocked her mercilessly, not just for being with Martell, but for choosing him, again and again, long after the truth had stopped being deniable. For Melody, this chaos marked not her collapse, but her quiet rise. She didn't need to throw shade, hop on Instagram Live, or clap back in dramatic fashion. Her power came from stillness. Every photo she shared, every measured word she offered, carried more impact than any rant her critics could muster. What Martell and Arionne failed to realize was that silence had become Melody's loudest declaration. The more they fumed, the stronger her calm appeared. By the time gossip sites began buzzing about potential lawsuits, financial ruin, and whispers of government scrutiny into Martell's dealings, the story had outgrown its reality TV roots. This was no longer about broken relationships, had morphed into a modern parable of ego, betrayal, and accountability. Fans weren't just spectators anymore. They were witnesses to a downfall, years in the making. And Martell, once convinced of his invincibility, was learning a brutal truth. Once the public turns on you, no smile, no charm, no clever spin can bring them back. His unraveling was no longer just televised, it was lived in real time, streamed, shared, and dissected by millions. What used to play as weekly drama now felt like a slow-motion crash. Every dent and fracture amplified by the collective gaze of social media. The audience had chosen its hero, and it was Melody. From that point on, every one of Martell's words, gestures, and interviews was examined like evidence. He hadn't just lost the narrative, he'd become the cautionary tale parents cited when warning about the dangers of unchecked pride. Clips of his most smug interviews resurfaced in endless loops, now set to mocking captions. That once famous grin, the one that used to charm crowds, was reinterpreted as arrogance, cruelty, blindness. His old soundbites became viral lessons in hubris. And the internet, ever hungry for spectacle, wasn't simply observing his downfall anymore, it was accelerating it. The business world took notice too. Sponsors quietly withdrew. Event organizers deleted flyers overnight, and brands once proud to be linked to him went silent. Then came the darker rumors. Whispers about taxes, shady deals, and debts, tucked behind layers of image management. Whether or not they were true didn't matter. In the court of public opinion, suspicion was enough to bury him. To fans, Martell had stopped being a man and become a symbol, a headline in waiting. A documentary subject in the making. Arion. Curry didn't escape unscathed either. The backlash against her turned vicious. Once infamous as the other woman, she was now labeled the enabler, the woman who cheered on chaos and mistook proximity to scandal for relevance. Every time she tried to defend herself online, her words backfired spectacularly, twisted into memes that mocked her loyalty to a man clearly sinking. She had wanted visibility, and she got it, but not the kind that grows a brand. Hers was the kind that scorched reputations to ash. Behind the scenes, producers faced an impossible bind. Martell had always been their wildfire, unpredictable, magnetic, and essential to the show's energy. But now, the flames were burning the house down. Sponsors didn't want to touch him, and cast members feared being branded complicit by staying quiet. Long-standing alliances fractured under the weight of public outrage. Some publicly distanced themselves. Others issued vague, awkward statements that pleased no one. For the first time, love and marriage, Huntsville itself seemed at risk, its foundation shaking beneath the pressure of its own star's implosion. And then there was Melody in mood, unshaken, radiant in her composure. Her grace had become her signature, her silence, her most eloquent response. While others raised their voices, she found strength in quiet. While others spun in chaos, she found clarity in stillness. What once looked like restraint now read as strategy. What once seemed like politeness now carried the weight of power. In an industry where outrage is currency and attention is survival, Melody chose the one path no one expected: peace. Every image she shared, every soft smile, every calm statement sent ripples through a world addicted to noise. Her silence became its own form of storytelling. Without saying a word, she reminded everyone watching that you don't have to scream to be heard, you only have to stand firm long enough for the noise to burn itself out. The transformation was slow, but viewers who once pitied her began to see her differently. They no longer saw a woman broken by betrayal, but one refined by it. She carried the kind of composure that couldn't be rehearsed, the kind earned only by surviving the fire and refusing to let it harden you. She didn't retaliate or weaponize sympathy. She simply rebuilt herself in full view of the public, piece by steady piece. And the audience noticed. They saw in her a kind of modern resilience rarely celebrated on reality television, a quiet defiance that didn't depend on scandal or spectacle. She wasn't the woman scorned. She was the woman reborn. The fandom that grew around her was less about celebrity and more about symbolism. To them, Melody became the embodiment of self-worth reclaimed, of strength without cruelty, of femininity that didn't need to be loud to be undeniable. What had begun as gossip had matured into something more profound, a conversation about legacy, ego, and the cost of self-destruction. It wasn't just about Martell and Melody anymore. It was about the dynamics that play out in homes, in workplaces, in the quiet spaces where control masquerades as love. It was about the way arrogance convinces a man that he can break the woman beside him and still keep his crown. Martell Holt had spent years believing that dominance equaled power, on screen and off. He wore control like a second skin. He dictated, deflected, and demanded. For a long time, the act worked. People mistook his bravado for confidence, his manipulation for charm. But arrogance is a fragile shield, it cracks the moment people stop believing in the illusion. The reckoning didn't come as an explosion. It came as erosion, a slow, steady unraveling of everything he had built. Each headline, each leaked rumor, each viral clip chipped away at the persona he'd crafted so carefully. The smirk that once symbolized success now read as condescension. His laughter, once magnetic, sounded hollow. His words, once commanding, echoed back with no conviction left in them. He had been the center of his own universe for too long. But the thing about building an empire on ego is that it requires constant applause to stay standing. The moment the clapping stops, the silence becomes unbearable. And Martell found himself alone in that silence, stripped of the validation he had mistaken for love. Stripped of the loyalty he had mistaken for fear. The fall wasn't just personal, it was cultural. Viewers began to question the patterns they'd once normalized. They examined how often women were painted as bitter for setting boundaries. How often men were praised for confidence that was really control. Martell's unraveling forced a wider reflection, one about accountability, image, and the dangerous glamour of toxic masculinity packaged for entertainment. Melody, meanwhile, didn't campaign for vindication. It arrived naturally. Her quiet consistency was the contrast that made Martell's chaos visible in full color. Every time he spoke, she didn't. Every time he lashed out, she held her ground. In the art of public perception, restraint became her revolution. It wasn't that she was perfect, she was simply centered. Her strength didn't come from denying pain but from acknowledging it without letting it define her. People related to that. Women who had been dismissed, talked over, underestimated, they saw themselves in her. Men, too, began to see how power wielded carelessly corrodes not only relationships but reputation in the public's eyes. Martell's story became a cautionary tale of self-inflicted ruin. His name turned from brand to warning label. He was no longer the protagonist of his own narrative, but the example whispered about in conversations on pride and downfall. Clips of his old interviews resurfaced like ghosts, those confident grins, those half-smirks. Social media turned them into montages of irony. Side-by-side comparisons of then and now, annotated with captions about karma and consequence. And it wasn't just digital ridicule that stung. Real-world consequences followed. Sponsors stepped away. Invitations dried up. Events scrubbed his image from promotional material overnight. The empire he had built on charm and exposure began collapsing faster than anyone expected. It wasn't just that people were laughing, it was that they had stopped caring. What makes a downfall public is not the fall itself, but the collective gaze that refuses to look away. Martell's story was replayed, dissected, and meme feed until it ceased to belong to him at all. He had become public property, a narrative stripped of control, a man defined by his missteps, and through it all, Melody rose not because she chased glory, but because she embodied grace. The very qualities once dismissed as weakness, patience, composure, became her superpower. She didn't need to reinvent herself, she simply stopped explaining herself. Her dignity became her armor. Her poise, the final word in a conversation she no longer needed to have. The symbolism of it all didn't go unnoticed. Commentators began calling it the Melody effect, the phenomenon of a woman reclaiming her narrative through calm defiance rather than confrontation. It was a shift that resonated far beyond Huntsville. It spoke to something larger, a collective hunger for authenticity in a culture drowning in spectacle, in a world that rewards outrage. Melody's refusal to perform rage became revolutionary. Her story reminded people that healing could coexist with power. That strength didn't always announce itself. Kit could stand quietly in the corner, unbothered and unstoppable. And so, when the dust finally began to settle, the contrast between them was impossible to ignore. Martell, once the embodiment of ambition and charisma, stood as a cautionary monument to ego's collapse. Melody, once the target of his arrogance, stood taller than ever, not as a victim, but as a testament to endurance, faith, and self-respect. This wasn't just the end of a television arc, it was a cultural mirror. It asked uncomfortable questions about who we celebrate and why, about how isolated charm can mask cruelty, about how public redemption requires humility, and how rarely men like Martell are willing to pay that price. His story didn't just entertain, it instructed. It exposed the gap between perception and reality, the danger of confusing applause with acceptance. And in the ashes of his reputation, one truth remained unshaken: power built on manipulation will always collapse under the weight of truth. Martell Holt, once the face of Huntsville's drive and drama, had become its cautionary tale, a living study in how quickly charisma curdles when stripped of accountability. But in the same frame stood Melody, serene, composed, untouchable. Her triumph wasn't loud or vengeful, it was steady, spiritual, complete. She didn't just win the narrative, she transcended it. Her story was no longer about survival, it was about legacy, about what remains after the noise fades, about the rare kind of victory that doesn't need to be announced because it speaks for itself. And that, perhaps, was the real ending Huntsville never expected, not the fall of a man, but the rise of a woman who learned that silence, when rooted in truth, can echo louder than any scandal ever could.